Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for our webinar on resources for faith-based organizations. We will be getting started shortly in the next 2 or 3 minutes. All right, for the sake of time and to stay in the time frame we promised, we would like to go ahead and get started with our webinar on resources for faith-based organizations. So first, I will start by turning it over to our minority leader, Representative Anthony Daniels.
Thank you, Katie, and thank you to the members and the participants that are tuning in here on Zoom, as well as those that are tuning in on Facebook Live. Today's presentation is going to focus primarily on faith-based organization and nonprofits. And so we have with us today two panelists, Trevor Smalls and also Jason Isbell. And so we'll begin with Jason Isbell going through the process for faith-based and nonprofit organizations, the process that was used. We do understand that right now the Paycheck Protection Program, all the funds have been exhausted for that, but I think that there is an anticipation that in the future that some funding be restored. That's not something that I have the answers to as to the likelihood of that happening. But I think that having conversations with our federal delegation is also important as we move forward to push for that. But without further ado, I present to you Jason Isbell.
Thank you, Representative Daniels. I appreciate that. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jason Isbell, and I am the Vice President of Legal and Governmental Affairs for the Alabama Bankers Association. We are based in Montgomery, but we represent banks in all corners of Alabama. And so chances are the bank that you use for your personal or business use is a member of our association. And so we certainly want to reach out to you any way that we can and offer any help that we can. And we appreciate Representative Daniels and Senator Singleton and the rest of the Alabama Democratic Caucus for providing this opportunity for Trevor and myself to maybe talk a little bit about this program and answer some questions today. Just to piggyback off what the leader was saying, in the $2.2 trillion CARES Act that Congress passed near the end of March, there was included a $349 billion appropriation to something called the Paycheck Protection Program. Congress said that the Paycheck Protection Program would be run by the U.S. Treasury Department, and more specifically, the U.S. Treasury Department's Small Business Administration. The goal of the Paycheck Protection Program, or the PPP program, was to try and make sure that eligible small businesses had enough money to get through an 8-week period of time. And during that 8-week period, the goal was for the employment and compensation levels of that business to be maintained. And if there was any funds left over, for that money to go to things like mortgages, rents, and utilities. So it is not necessarily a long-term solution, but it is certainly designed to be a bridge between hopefully a time where things are bad and a time where things have gotten a lot better from an economic standpoint. So I'm going to center my remarks a little bit on the PPP program, and I know that we'll probably have some questions from some of the folks on this Zoom call with us. So if you are a business with 500 or fewer employees, generally speaking, you are going to automatically be eligible to apply for a PPP loan. Now, there are certain circumstances where you can have more than 500 employees. Those are normally reserved for things like restaurants. But I think most of us on this call today can sort of live under that general statement that if you have 500 or fewer employees, you are eligible to apply for a PPP loan. That means if you have one employee and that employee is yourself, you are eligible to apply for one of these loans. It's also important, I think, for this call in particular, to note that faith-based organizations are eligible to apply for these funds. Now, that's important because generally speaking, there has been a thought that those types of organizations were excluded from SBA funding programs. But the SBA released a special document in early April talking about how faith-based organizations qualified for PPP funding, and I know that there are several who have taken advantage of that already. A PPP loan can be applied. You can apply for a PPP loan at any lending institution. You can't go through the Small Business Administration for this particular funding program. There are other funding programs that are available that you can access, but for those you have to go through the SBA. For this one, you can in theory go to any participating lending institution. Now, some banks, and I'll just speak from banks, some banks are taking a different stance on that. Some banks say we will only allow our own customers to apply for PPP loans at our bank. Some banks are saying we will only allow our customers that are nonprofits or that are businesses with, say, fewer than 50 employees to apply at our bank. Banks have the ability to make that decision. The good thing is you don't have to apply for one of these loans at your bank, whatever that phrase means to you. You can go to another institution and apply for one of these loans if your particular bank, for some reason, is not cooperative with your particular situation. You do not necessarily have to be at your bank to apply for one of these loans. Now, when we think about a loan in sort of the traditional sense, let's say I'm thinking about buying a car. If I go to a bank, if I go to Bank A and tell them that I want to buy this brand new car, they're going to want a lot of information from me. They're going to want to know what my credit looks like. They're going to want to know what type of collateral can I put up for the loan? What is my funding stream? How do I plan to pay this loan back? Well, I can gather all that information and submit it to Bank A and then go down the street to Bank B, and I might find that I have a completely different terms. They might not need the same credit score, or they might not want the same level of collateral. It might be totally different there. It's important to know that for a Paycheck Protection loan, you get the same terms at any institution. You don't have to worry about personal guarantees or collaterals or revenue streams or anything like that. So all borrowers and all lenders are on the same level playing field. That's an important thing to point out with this loan. When you go get a traditional car loan, you also have to start thinking about the terms of the loan, the interest rate on the loan, and when you have to pay it back. A Paycheck Protection loan, however, is a little bit different. The term of the loan for everybody is 2 years. You don't have to start paying it back until 6 months after you get the first piece of funding. And whatever you pay back, the interest rate is 1%. Now, the biggest thing that separates a Paycheck Protection loan from a traditional loan is that if you spend the proceeds right, then you have a forgivable loan. So if during the 8-week period that this loan is intended to cover, you spend at least 75% of the proceeds on maintaining employment and compensation levels, and you spend anything else on things we discussed earlier, like mortgages, rent, and utilities, then this becomes a grant and not a loan. And whatever loan amount you receive will be forgiven by the federal government. Again, if for some reason you say that you end up spending some of this money on an important piece of equipment that just happened to break down during that 8-week period, that's fine. You're allowed to do that, but you'll have to pay at least part of the loan back at that 1% interest rate, 2-year term, 6-month deferral. To me, those are some of the most important parts about the PPP loan. Now, if you're thinking about it from the aspect of an individual borrower, you're probably wondering, how much can I borrow? It's a fair question. And the way to figure that out is the same for everybody. You take your average monthly total payroll and you multiply that number by 2.5. So let's say you can calculate your payroll one of 2 ways. You can use your total payroll for 2019 for the entire year, or you can use the previous 12 months payroll. Let's say for all of those months, whether it's all of 2019 or the past 12 months, just for simplicity's sake, let's say that my total payroll was $12,000 during that entire time was $12,000. So my average monthly total payroll would be $1,000. The amount of loan I can get is 2.5 times that $1,000 amount. So if that was my situation, then I could apply for a PPP loan of up to $2,500. So it's an easy way to calculate the amount of the loan that you can borrow. The application is the same for everybody. In fact, you can go online right now and see that application and actually fill it out. In fact, some banks let you fill out all that paperwork online, but some of them you're going to want to get either face-to-face or phone-to-phone with your banker. But the Small Business Administration's website, which is sba.gov, or the Treasury Department's website, which is treasury.gov, has all of this information on there, as well as different frequently asked questions that you might be asking. One last thing from me, Mr. Daniels, and then I'll turn it back over to you and to Katie and to whomever. If I am a faith-based organization, I am probably worried about intermingling what I do with the government, and that's an understandable fear. I would argue, though, that the Small Business Administration has taken great pains, frankly, to make sure that you know that your eligibility for this program is the same as any other for-profit business or non-for-profit business, and that nothing that you do as far as this application goes is going to disrupt the autonomy, I'll say, that you have from the government. You get to operate just as you've been operating. You just apply for this loan just like any of the other eligible businesses that are out there. And if there are not-for-profits on the line today, I'll point out that you must be a 501c3 to apply for one of these PPP loans. There are other categories such as a veterans organization or a tribal concern, but entities like a 501c4 or a 501c6, such as the Alabama Bankers Association, they are prohibited from filing it. It's only reserved for the 501c3s. So with that, I'll turn it back over to whomever I need to. Happy to stay on the line, of course, and answer any questions that might come up.
Thank you, Jason. And now we will turn it over to our second speaker, Trevor Small.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Trevor Small. I'm the managing partner at Simplified Management Products. And as Representative Daniels mentioned, we are aware that the funds have been depleted, but there is conversation around, potentially, some discussion about refunding potentially, but we don't know if or when that's going to happen. So knowing that at least there's a conversation around it, I'm going to come from the perspective of kind of preparing for if there is a second round. So all of our faith-based organizations, if you did not receive your PPP funds, now is the time for you to start really saying, okay, I'm going to aggressively approach trying to get some of this money. So then you ask yourself, what would I need to even start? The first thing you need to do is start a conversation with your bank, as Jason mentioned. Whether that means you send an email, you log onto the online banking portal, or whatever you need to do. If you know a banker at your bank, you want to reach out to them. So that's where you start. The second thing is start getting the organizational documents together that the church initially filed when they became a 501c3. Just as Jason mentioned, depending on the bank, depending on the documentation requirement that you have to submit. So I have seen some banks ask for actual organizational docs as they appear on the Secretary of State's website, as well as whomever is on those articles as primary kind of administrators of the church would also have to be on some of this PPP information. That's just so everything stays uniform to some degree. So therefore, if you made amendments to your church articles, but never filed them with the state, meaning you changed people's names, you changed officers or things of that nature, it's important that you do your amendment. Because that may play a factor on if your application is held up or not. As I mentioned, it just depends on the bank. The other thing is determining what your payroll cost is and really identifying that. So if you're a 501c3 and you pay all of your all your people as contractors, then you need to make sure you discuss with the bank that, hey, how is this calculated? Because some of your contractors may be able to apply on their own, and you can't claim that cost within your loan amount. So it's important that you know your numbers and understand, okay, I know what my payroll cost is, I know what my rent cost is, I know what all my cost is as it relates to me operating my church or my faith-based organization. That's very, very, very important. So the biggest thing right now, and the perspective in which we need to be thinking about this, is from if and or when. So first thing is reach out to your bank, see what they're going to require. Second thing is to go back and say, okay, we have our checklist now. Let's gather these documents up. The third thing you need to do is whatever you don't have, you need to reach out to the bank and say, okay, I don't have that exact thing. So what can I submit in lieu of that? So the example that I can give you is I had some clients who applied, but they hadn't done their tax return yet. So we had to ask the question of, okay, I have not filed my taxes yet. What can we submit in exchange of that? Some of them ask for a profit and loss or income statement. Some of them ask for just a pro forma of what potentially what your tax return would look like. So we must understand right now is a preparation period. So all of us who were upset that, yes, the money has been depleted, which we understand that is a very frustrating feeling, especially for you faith-based organizations, because you all's application couldn't start until, if you don't have employees, it couldn't be applied until Monday. So right now is the time that we start preparing for if and or when they do a second round of funding. So therefore you will be in a position to say, I'm ready to submit. You won't have all the grunt work to say, okay, let me go back and let me contact the treasurer. And then the treasurer may be out of pocket for a day or two. Now you've lost a day or two of trying to get your application submitted. And now funds may be depleted again. But we must remember the conversation around the second round is not the same amount of money. So if it took a week and a half for this money to go, as far as when the applications could be actually submitted, then you need to cut that time in half and anticipate that the money may be gone shorter than that if it is approved. So we must right now act very diligent on when we start getting our documents together and opening up the lines of communication with the banks to see if they're even participating in the PPP program. And if not, you need to find a bank who is accepting new account holders. And then that's where your conversation needs to start. So I would encourage all of you all, reach out to the people who you have your best banking relationship with. And then that's where you should probably start asking the questions of what do I need to do? So if we can, you want to start the Q&A, Representative Daniels, or how do you want to handle that?
Yes, Katie, she's going to be facilitating the Q&A and at this time, thanks.
Yeah, so and viewers, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the chat box for the Q&A, and we will ask the panelists from there. My first question, so if churches do not know their tax exempt status at this time, do they have to request that to be eligible, or can they just go ahead and fill out the paperwork?
So if they don't have their 501c3, can they apply for it now?
Yeah. Are they eligible?
Well, no, one, that process takes an extremely long time to even get approved. So no, you can't apply now just to say, okay, I need to apply for this money. I think they do have a deadline. I didn't see the well, yes, it says it must be written before February 15th, 2020. So if they didn't submit before then they couldn't submit now and then still apply under that rule.
Hey, let me piggyback on what Trevor said. One of the certifications that you have to make when you apply for a PPP loan is that you existed and had employees on February the 15th. if the church didn't have a 501c3 designation, but there is some sort of other corporate, I don't know, entity status that they could exist under, then in theory they could apply under, under that company structure.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So let me just give a brief kind of real high level. So before you become a 501c3, you must be a corporation first. So you're an established entity. So just as Jason mentioned, for all intents and purposes of applying, yes, you can apply, but it wouldn't be under the 501c3 IRS code. You would be just applying as a legal entity and follow the rules in which are laid out for those type of entities.
Thanks. Our next question. So my church has a 501c3 status umbrella under our denomination. Are we still eligible?
So I had this question the other day. So this is the example that I'm gonna use because this was the scenario that was presented to me. If you're a Methodist organization, if your big organization, which is the Methodist organization, they have these sub, I guess, areas in different places. If the big organization applies, then it should filter down to you all because the payroll cost should be, their payroll cost should include you. But if that is not the case, and if that entity has its own 501c3 and its own EIN number, and for some reason a bigger organization does not, it does not exclude those little subsidiary organizations from applying. So that's something that you would probably talk with that parent organization with on the direction they want you all to go, and then make that decision.
Let me also comment on that. The Small Business Administration made clear that in situations like Trevor is describing and that's described in the question, that you don't count all of the employees in the entire umbrella corporation. So if your church is part of an overall denominational umbrella, and let's say that the large parent company did not submit an application that included you, you do not have to count all of the employees in the umbrella toward your count, even though technically on a corporate level, you might all be employed by the same person. That's important because, again, if it gets over that $500 employee threshold, then the Paycheck Protection Program is probably not going to be the way to go.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Our next question says, our clergy housing allowances considered as part of the salary compensation package?
I have not seen that language specifically, but if it's paid out and included in their W-2, I would say yes, because it's a part of their salary.
Okay, and this is a follow-up about the umbrella. It says, we have our own EIN number, but not our own 501c3 status. We have confirmation paperwork from the United Church of Christ that says we have 501c3 status under them.
Yeah, that's kind of just what we just answered, kind of going back to just that. If that larger organization is predicated on what they do and the numbers they use to calculate their payroll costs, would determine if the sub-organizations apply. So it's very important that if you're part of one of those type of denominational type of organizations, that you have a conversation with that parent organization. That's when you would know what direction you need to go in, because if you can't apply for the same employee under two different EIN numbers, I guess, if you're part of the same organization.
Yeah, that was the point I was going to make, Trevor, is that the fact that this questioner has an individualized EIN number is probably helpful. They can sort of be treated as their own entity. And it seems like the questioner is maybe hung up a little bit on whether or not there's 501c3 status granted to that employee ID number. Whether you're a 501c3 entity or not, like we said earlier, is not necessarily the threshold question. It's not necessarily the most important thing. The most important thing is that you're some type of entity, and you had employees on February the 15th. Whether you're 501c3 or an S corporation or C corporation or LLC or self-employed, you run the list. Just because you may be a little, confused on the status of your 501c3, it does not preclude you from applying for one of these loans.
Yes.
I'll piggyback too, while we're kind of in a break, on something that Trevor said a minute ago. The funding for the Paycheck Protection Program did run out. Technically, it ran out yesterday at about noon time. All $349 billion had been allocated. The Small Business Administration has taken the stance, as of right now, that they are not going to let people continue to apply. In essence, they're not going to have applications waiting in line or waiting in queue for the reauthorization of funding, if that does happen, and I believe that it will. Right now, it is just kind of a waiting period, frankly, and nobody knows what's going to happen. But there definitely seems to be some very high-level discussions about an additional $251 billion being appropriated for the program. That probably won't happen until Tuesday at the earliest. But as Trevor indicated, we've seen how quickly $349 billion was allocated. 251 would likely be just as quick. We don't believe that Congress is going to determine how those funds need to be allocated, such as 10% for Alabama or 5% for churches. So it may just be a first come, first serve, free for all, just as it was with the original round of funding. But in theory, Congress could not only sort of determine how the funds should be allocated, they could also change all of these rules that we're talking about. Now, I don't think anybody believes that they will, because these rules have been developed very quickly and have been changed a lot. And now everybody's to a place where they're kind of comfortable with them. But it just goes back to Trevor's first point. Contacting your banker is certainly something that ought to be on the top of your to-do list if you've not already applied for one of these.
Thank you. We had an additional question around tithes. So, like, how do they account for tithes, or do they account for tithes when reporting?
So you got to remember that this is a payroll. I'm gonna say loan grant. So tithes are real, if you would consider revenue. So if you're paying your staff or paying your pastor from the tithes, then it's what you pay the person is what you're calculating. You're not calculating the loss of the tithes or the offerings. So no tithes, the language tithes, and no replacing the tithes that you lost that's not what this is for. If you're looking to do that, then you would look at that EIDL loan to help with some working capital. But you can't, this PPP is not to replace tithes. It's just to make sure that the staff that you have is paid, and then if you decide to use 75% to pay them, and then the other 25% for those minimal operating costs, rent, utilities, mortgage interest, and some debt interest. That's what this is designed to do.
Okay, next one. If my church runs a daycare separately, should they apply for separate loans?
If the church has its own EIN number and the daycare has its own EIN number, then both entities can apply. But you cannot include, if it's the same organization, for all intents and purposes, you can't include the same person under both companies if it's really one company.
Yeah, Trevor's exactly right. It is a loan that is designed to replace payroll costs. So if you've got payroll costs for the church, then the church would apply for a loan to help with those payroll costs. Separately, if you've got a daycare or other type of auxiliary organization like that that has its own individual employee ID number, then it would be treated as an entirely different operation, just like if you had, you know, a McDonald's and a Burger King, two totally different things, because they have the two different employee identification numbers.
Thanks. Our next question was, is there any data that reflects which states and industries receive funding? I'm curious to know how much went to nonprofits in the Black Belt.
I can answer that to some degree. The Small Business Administration has attempted to try and release that data. In fact, not 15 minutes before this phone call, I received something from them that shows essentially all approvals from the first round of the funding, the $349 billion in funding. Alabama had 27,922 approved Paycheck Protection Program loans, for a total amount loaned out of $4.86 billion. So about 28,000 loans and about $5 billion went to businesses in Alabama. That doesn't necessarily mean they got those loans from Alabama banks, and these aren't loans from Alabama banks. These are based on the location of the applicant. Now, to put that in perspective, that's 28,000 loans out of a total loan count of nearly 1.7 million loans. And that's, you know, just shy of 5 billion in approved loans on a total approval count of the whole $349 billion. It should be noted that when I ran these numbers probably 2 days ago, Alabama was tracking a little bit, I would say, ahead of schedule on where it should be. Alabama is the 24th populous state in America, but we were 21st in terms of the numbers of loans we've issued and 22nd in terms of the size of the loan issued. It's interesting to think about which states are really ahead of the game. For some reason, and I don't know the explanation for this, North Dakota, of all states, has issued loans covering over 70% of its eligible payroll. Alabama's number is closer to about 54%. But heavily populated states like Texas and California have certainly taken more in PPP loans than anybody else. For example, our number was just below $5 billion approved. Texas is $28 billion approved. California is $33 billion approved. Florida is next at 18 billion. Excuse me, New York has $20 billion approved. They're next in that. The average loan size is, well, I should say this. The average loan is for $150,000 or less. Almost 75% of all of the loans are for $150,000 or less. The construction industry, the professional and technical industry, manufacturing, and healthcare combined, those four industry sectors total about 50% of all of the loans that have been let out. So construction is leading the way with nearly $45 billion in approved dollars. To the question specifically, there is nothing that I can see that shows anything that is as detailed, I'll say, as where inside a particular state these funds are going. Because again, there were no allocation streams. It was first come, first serve, free for all. And so there's nothing that says X amount of dollars has to go here, Y amount of dollars has to go here. But I'll say this, it doesn't appear like nonprofits are specifically included as an industry sector here. So I can't help with that question either, but I thought the state-specific data might be of interest.
Thanks for sharing that with us. Now, Trevor, did you have something to say?
No, ma'am.
Okay. Well, now I'm going to open it up to our members. So members, any of the panelists, if you have additional questions for our panelists, you can ask them at this time.
I think that, Katie, we have someone, if someone from any of the congressional delegations, staffers would like to make any comment about relative to whether or not funding would be available, additional funding would be available in their mind, or they're working on some legislation that will further help people that missed out on the loan opportunities.
Representative Daniels, this is Brantley Fry with Senator Jones' office. I can just give a small update. I think Jason alluded to this earlier. Congress is working on the next package. They're calling this 3.5, thinking about the last package, CARES Act, being the COVID relief package 3. So this package will address small businesses, and Senator Jones is also working with others and his colleagues to also include funding for local governments. There was funding in the CARES Act for local governments, but that was limited to their expenses for direct COVID relief. He's trying to get funding in there that would allow for local governments to collect relief to show that they've lost revenue, but they still have the day-to-day cost of running a government, providing fire protection, providing police protection, and so forth. So those are the things that he's working on and with his colleagues. And Jason mentioned Tuesday of next week. I agree that that would be the earliest we'll see anything come out of Congress, but we're hoping that it's going to be sooner rather than later.
Thank you for that update. And this may be just something for Senator Jones and something Jason may be able to answer as well. Is there a way for us to really look at a breakdown of company size, region, location, just so that we see kind of who got the funding and what that data looks like, just so that as we move forward and really putting together the legislation that will be coming up, making certain that we are providing opportunities for those that may have been denied, but still in a tough situation, on things that we can do to really loosen the regulations or make some other adjustments so that these individuals will be able to qualify for the funding, and also making certain that safeguards in place for those that have qualified for the funding can't go back for another round somehow. So we just want to make certain that we are doing things in a manner to where tremendous transparency on who got the funding, what the demographic data, location data, regional data of those that have gotten the funding, specifically here in Alabama, and so that we can understand kind of what we're dealing with.
Sorry, I was on mute. Yes, we are looking for that data. We don't have that data so far, but we are looking for it. So as we have that information, and SBA, Jason said earlier, has provided some of that information, but it's not quite the level of detail that you just mentioned. So it's yet to be seen as to whether and when they'll have that data available, but certainly that's something that we would want to see.
Thank you. Anything you want to add, Jason, or? Yeah.
Well, I certainly would defer to Senator Jones and their staff. It would come as no surprise that they're going to be at the tip of the spear of getting data. I just don't think, as she mentioned, that the SBA has released data with that level of specificity. And frankly, with all due respect to SBA, they're an entity that in a typical year is used to allocating about $30 billion in funding. So the fact that they've allocated, almost 12 times that in a fortnight, they've been certainly at overcapacity right now. And so we're to some degree very appreciative of the data that we have received. Speaking of data, and this is something that Senator Jones and his colleagues in Congress may be hearing more about today, but we were asked in partnership with our National Trade Association to try and figure out how many loans that we have remaining in the pipeline that essentially got in too late. And just in Alabama alone, we've got nearly $720 million worth of loans that are essentially standing behind the locked door, ready to go when and if an additional round of funding is approved. That is just a response from about half of the banks in Alabama, and that's just Alabama's response. So you've got to think on a nationwide scale as more and more folks are learning about this program and its benefits. It's crazy to think about getting, allocating $600 billion in, less than 3 weeks, but chances are that is going to be the case. So just to double down on what Trevor said, if you are a business entity that is going to apply for one of these, for a Paycheck Protection Program loan, and you've not started the process, please try and get started as quickly as possible, because once that door is open, there's going to be a lot of folks who are trying to get in there, and their paperwork may already be putting them a little bit ahead. So it's critical to illustrate the quickness, the need for quickness on this program.
And the other thing I want to say is the PPP is just one of the programs. So you still have that idle advance that's out there. So I want to encourage you all to encourage those nonprofits or those faith-based organizations to apply for that as well. Don't see the PPP as the only way to get some emergency funding or some funding to help with some of the financial strain that you're on. So there's still that doesn't require you going through the bank. That just requires you completing the application and submitting it and seeing if they choose you. And if they choose you, then they'll let you know how much you're going to allocate. They're going to allocate to you for whatever, based off the information that you put on the application.
Thank you. One other question we just had come up. To be clear, our applications whose status with our bank is in processing status, will we have to reapply when new funds are allocated?
I don't believe so. If you have submitted your application to the bank, then I believe, now again, this is Jason Isbell on a Friday afternoon. That's a long way away from Congress approving and the president signing and an agency administering. But I believe that you should be set. And to go back to that other analogy, you're one of the folks standing in line behind the door that should be ready to go. Let me also just flesh out a little bit about what Trevor just talked about. We did not really discuss much what he called the EIDL loan. That stands for Economic Injury Disaster Loan. That's something that the SBA makes available directly to a borrower. You don't have to go through a bank. Whenever a governor or the president declares a state of emergency, obviously the governor in Alabama and in every other state declared this a state of emergency. These are funds that are normally reserved in times of tornadoes or hurricanes or whatnot, but they are able to be applied for right now. You have to prove that you lost 50% of receipts versus a comparable time in the previous year in order to apply for one of those loans. You can't apply for an EIDL and a Paycheck Protection loan for the same purpose, but there are scenarios where you can apply for both of those. The major difference between the two, of course, is that for the EIDL loan, you can get long terms, you can get terms nearly 30 years for those loans, but generally speaking, they do have to get paid back. Now, there's some components of an EIDL advance that you can get. You basically get $1,000 advance for every employee you have. But again, you go straight through the SBA for that information, sba.gov, or just Google an EIDL loan, and you can find out more about that.
Awesome. I want to thank you, Trevor and Jason, for all of this valuable information. And thank you for Senator Doug Jones' staff stepping in to answer the questions on the federal level. And I will turn it over to Representative Daniels to close us out.
Thank you, Katie. I want to thank our staff and thank you again, Jason and Trevor, for offering this valuable information to people across the state of Alabama. And so thank you to all the viewers out there, whether you're on this webinar physically or whether you signed on through Facebook Live. Thank you guys for participating. We will continue to push out valuable content as we get information and new ideas on which content will be most valuable to our citizens. That's something that we will continue to flesh out. We will be having conversations about some other points that we know that citizens are thinking about that's on their mind right now. One of which is the census, and the other one is how we're going to deal with voting in light of this pandemic. Among other things, whether it's businesses and how they should operate from various industries. And so we'll continue to provide valuable content with you as we move forward. But thank you again for your participation, and thank the members that are on the call. Thank you guys for being a part of it and getting the word out in your districts and giving feedback on content as well. But until next time, we'll talk to you again next Thursday and send out information that may or may be valuable to you, and we look forward to you sharing that information so that everyone will have the same information that we have. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Daniels. And just a reminder, if you do have any additional questions, you can always email us at askahgc@gmail.com. And with that, we thank you for joining us, and this ends our meeting.